Chapter 14, we're going to be looking at how the Earth was formed, how the environment came to be what it is today, how life originated. We're going to be looking at some of the scientists and their experiments that led to some of this information. So as we look through this chapter, we have to keep in mind some of the things that we know today were not known back then. Some of the technology and instrumentation that we have today, such as microscopes, and the ability to see very, very microscopic organisms, was not something that was known back when a lot of these concepts were being developed. For example, if we have something like a piece of meat, we know that that needs to be kept in the refrigerator. We know we need to wash our hands because we could get bacteria that could make us sick. We know that if we leave it out, we might have something like this. Flies might land on it. We might have maggots develop because the flies lay their eggs. They didn't know these things back then because they didn't have any instrumentation to see something that small. So in the early days, before the 17th century, they believed in what's called spontaneous generation, that basically living things could appear from non-living things, could arise from nothing. What we know today is called biogenesis, that all living things have to come from something else that is alive. But that was not known back then. They believed things like the maggots that we saw in this picture come from rotten meat. They also believe things like if you have a grain bin in a barn, or maybe some of you have a farm where you store, like in a great big trash can, things like grain for your animals, that mice come from that grain. Not that mice can get in there and have their babies and then that's where they come from, but they couldn't see these things, so they had these beliefs that we know today aren't true. Beetles would come from cow dung. So the cow would go out in the field and do its business, and then bugs and beetles would come from the dung, the non-living cow manure. But we know now that these bugs and flies land on these things, lay their eggs, and that's where they come from. So one of the first scientists was Francesco Redi, 1668. And so he set out to disprove this spontaneous generation idea. He believed that the maggots that were on meat were coming from flies. And so he wanted to prove this by doing an experiment. So he got basically 2 jars, 2 pieces of meat, and he placed those flies, or placed the meat in 2 different sets of containers. So one control group did not have anything covering, basically there was no lid, and then another group had a cloth covering, so air could get through, but the flies couldn't get in. After several days, you can see here what would happen. The flies are getting in, they're laying their eggs, and maggots appeared. In the experimental group with the cloth, the flies couldn't get in, they couldn't lay their eggs, and no maggots appeared. And so this led him to show that if the flies can't get in there and lay their eggs, then you're not going to have maggots on flies. So they don't just spontaneously appear on the rotting meat. The flies have to cause the maggots to be there. The next experiment was Lazzaro Spallanzani, mid-1700s, and so he wanted to look at the spontaneous generation concept as well. And so he was looking at an experiment to test the air, looking for basically microorganisms. But again, they really weren't able to see as well as we can today. Mid-1700s, they did develop a microscope, so they could start to see some things. So he had this idea that some of the things that they thought were spontaneously appearing were coming from microorganisms in the air. So his experiment, he had 2 flasks of broth, and so one flask he was going to seal the mouth of the flask, and the other he was going to leave that open. So the first thing he did was boil both of the containers of the broth, and that would kill off any microorganisms that were there. One flask he left open, the other he sealed. And so the one that was left open, air could get in there, microorganisms from the air could get into the broth. The sealed one, they could not. And so then several days later, the one that was left open was cloudy because the microorganisms obviously grew in the broth, and the one that was sealed, it was clear, no microorganisms. And we now know today, yes, there are more microorganisms and bacteria and things in the air that are going to get in the broth and cause it to become cloudy. So he felt like his experiment was successful. However, a common thought back then was something called this vital force. And with this vital force, people believed that you had to have this vital force to have life. And so they said that his experiment took away the vital force that was in the air. And because of this, so this one where it was sealed, the vital force couldn't get in, so no life could form. This was one of the beliefs that the general public held strong, that they believed you have to have this vital force for things to be living. And so the idea of spontaneous generation continued on, even though we've had two successful experiments at this point that showed spontaneous generation is not something that is a valid concept. Then Louis Pasteur in the mid-1800s conducted an experiment to help disprove this need for vital force, and so it helped debunk the whole spontaneous generation idea. So what he did, he used a flask that had a curved neck. It was open to the air, so this vital force that they felt was necessary could get in. However, having the curved neck, any microorganisms or solid particles that might get into the broth are going to get caught in this neck, and they can't successfully get into the broth. So with the first test that he ran it for a long time, over a year, and so there was no growth. It remained clear. No microorganisms got in the broth. He broke off the neck, so then we know now microorganisms could go straight in, and then immediately, within a day, it began to get cloudy. So he was able to prove that spontaneous generation was not something that was valid, vital force was not something that was valid, and that microorganisms were actually what was causing the growth in this experiment.